before they get to the age of 27 or beyond the age of 27, if they see that there's a value in it for them, if there's something in it for them. So in a tribal society, there's something, there's an element, you know. I wanted my brother and my cousins, and we all talk of our male relatives as brothers and uncles, to be the most aggressive and domineering, because that protects us. I describe also these perspectives in the book, that is a different context. But then what happens when these encounters, such as large numbers of men immigrating from aggressive tribal religious societies and coming into a society where that, you know, most men have somehow found ways of channeling their aggression into something else. These encounters are happening, and it's affecting women, it's affecting children, it's affecting social cohesion, it's affecting how we think of ourselves as a liberal society, but it's also affecting how the young men who are arriving think of themselves as not belonging anywhere. And so right now the situation is lose-lose, because we don't want to have these conversations. There is a possibility, if you ask me about my optimism, there is a possibility at a win-win if we have the conversations, if we put everything on the table.
Do you know much about the immigration situation in Canada?
A little bit, yes. And I know that Canada in some ways looks more like Europe than North America. Because they took in large numbers of immigrant men, and some of these situations that I described, some of these anecdotes, I think I could see a lot of them happening in Canada.
Yeah, well, it's not been obvious to me that in cities like Montreal and Toronto, that we've seen a palpable increase in the kind of street activity that has produced a decrement in women's feeling of safety. I haven't, that's not something I've been personally aware of. I don't know if that means that Canada might be doing something right. It isn't obvious to me that our cities, Montreal and Toronto in particular, which have the biggest immigrant communities, especially Toronto, hasn't fallen prey to segregation and the development of communities that are distinctively separate from the other communities in the city. I mean, there are obviously ethnic enclaves in Toronto, but I've never had the sense that we have the same problem here, for example, as has manifested itself in France. You know, and Canada does have an official policy of multiculturalism, and I don't think that we're walking down the more intense assimilation route that you were describing. I mean, I'm obviously very pleased to see that. It's certainly not been part of the kind of problems that you're describing haven't really become part of the Canadian national conversation. I mean, it's a strange time now, of course, with everyone locked down with COVID, but it's possible. I don't know why things have perhaps turned out better here, but they seem to have.
Well, there's one, again, I'm not an expert on Canadian immigration and integration policies, but one thing that I found striking about Canada is the selection at the gate. So Canada has its own resettlement policies. It has a very aggressive, I would say, compared to some other countries, trying to get in skilled labor. For instance, you have to speak English, you have to meet a lot of criteria before you can get into Canada. But there's also geography. I mean, if you look at the way it's become incredibly difficult for European authorities to keep out spontaneous immigration. So everybody wants to select their immigrants. And for some countries, it's easier than others. And I think in Canada and Australia are some of the countries that have that geographical component.
Well, that's a good point. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. We're not as close to Syria. And so that protected, or that distanced us from the downstream consequences of the Syrian conflict.
And not just the Syrian conflict, the economic travails of the continent of Africa. You can come through Libya, you can come through, people just arrive in boats, and the European authorities that are, that deploy the coast guards are confronted with, do you let these fellow human beings die, or do you rescue them and bring them in? And then when you bring them in, whose responsibility are they? And the conversation doesn't seem to go beyond that. And I don't think you've seen something like that in Canada. We've seen something like this in the US from some of these failed or failing Latin American countries with the caravans and building the wall. And so we have those conversations in America, but I don't know.
No, I think that's a good analysis. The simplest explanation could well be that Canada's geographical position has protected it against many of the events, or shielded us against many of the events that have made immigration such a contentious issue in other countries.
Yeah, because you can select beforehand. And also I think Canada deports. Canada requires, as far as I know, that if you want to go and work and live there, that you have someone to sponsor you. They have all of these requirements that they can actually enforce. Having said that, you've had a number of honor killings in Canada. You've had a number of terrorist attacks in Canada. You have a number of extreme right-wing incidents and attacks in Canada. So it's not like you're protected from some of these manifestations.
So you suggested just a few minutes ago that, and this is an extremely contentious issue. I mean, one of the things I was struck when I read your book, Infidel, it was so interesting to see how you responded to Dutch culture, because I got to see what one of the Western countries looked like through the eyes of someone who was decidedly non-Western. I remember, for example, your amazement when you saw that a Dutch bus, that there was a sign indicating when a Dutch bus, public transportation bus, was going to arrive, and that it actually arrived at that time. And I thought that was an extremely powerful part of the book, because it is a kind of miracle that sort of thing can occur. It requires an incredible amount of social organization. And Holland is a great example of a country that couldn't even exist without that large-scale, tightly knit, almost machine-like organization, given that a huge proportion of their country would actually be underwater if it failed.
Right.
And you made a case in Infidel, and you're making a case now that in order for the West to develop an effective integration policy that would enable an effective